Over the past 5 years I've been doing this channel, I've made some really great pieces, and inevitably some not so great pieces. I've been working on a collection for the past year, and while I do some strategizing there, I'm going to redo some of the not so great pieces. Bonus points if I can make them work with the collection. The decision to redo some pieces was made really with one ensemble in mind. I'm sorry if this was your fave, but she has a lot working against her. I made this look as part of a study where I was examining and working through the way different iconic designers use historicism. For the purposes of a study, I think the ensemble was effective-ish, but it doesn't check any of my personal style boxes. My style is sort of deconstructed Victorian Gothic, like if Margiela styled Nadja. I mean, talk about a mashup I would love to see. So let's break down the issues with this look so we have a sort of style rubric for the redo. First, the dress. The style is okay, kind of a sweet, prissy little dress. I like the material. It's a dubious silk satin, sold to me as silk, but probably some sort of poly viscose something or other in dusty rose. I love dusty rose, but it actually doesn't work with my skin tone. Little designer hack, if working with a challenging color, don't put it next to the face. Put a buffer color next to the face. The trim is a rickrack with pearls. I love a good kitschy reference, but this one just adds to the overall sweetness of the look. So yeah, total gut job. I worked very hard on this vest. I put probably 10 plus hours into the bird in particular. I may save the bird. But yeah, this is going to be a gut job also. I do love black velvet, so I'm thinking this is myself and the satin is the lining. Right now I'm thinking I want to do a dress with a waist. I just came across the most amazing pin on Pinterest. I was disassociating in a meeting, as you do, and I came across this piece on Etsy. I think this is available, by the way, if anyone wants it. It's this, I'm going to guess, late 19th, early 20th century Renaissance-esque costume. I mean, Victorian does Renaissance, ain't that just this channel in a nutshell? And it's basically our color scheme. Well, this may be dark blue and lilac, but close enough. You can see slashing here at the sleeve, very similar to what was happening in the 16th century, but of course there's some Victorian imagination at work as well. The inside is also a work of art. There's some padding. For the record, I would rock the heck out of this as is, but I think that I want to make a more modern version of it. I think I want to do something cropped, kind of clean up the surface texture a little bit, make it a little bit cleaner on the edges. I think I want to have the shoulders kind of wide and like dropping off, more like the early 16th century, make it a little bit more boxy, kind of like menswear of the time. But I do want to keep the slashing on the sleeves, which I think is a little bit more like fantasy based. Almost reminds me of like trunk hose of the late 16th, early 17th century. Okay, way too many references here, I'll figure it out. First though, I needed to take apart the existing pieces. Not gonna lie, I did this first thing just to make sure I actually went through with it. Taking things apart to upcycle them can be pretty tedious, even more so if it's something that you originally made. I picked off all the edging and removed the sleeves. I removed the sequins from the velvet to reveal the markings beneath. I don't know why I didn't think of the markings in the first place, as though I had just thrown the sequins on willy-nilly. Luckily, the markings washed out. I also remembered the vest was originally made from the cabbage of a totally different project, so there was a lot of piecing in the panels of the vest, which I took apart. I could have started with a Renaissance bodice or a Victorian bodice pattern. Instead, I started with my t-shirt pattern. I shortened it to the desired length and created a rounded squared neckline. The sleeves of the original have this interesting slashing above the slashing, so I divided the sleeve pattern into 1 3/4 inch slashes and drew a little upper cap in. Best to number these lest they become hopelessly confusing. I also went in and added a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the long sides of both the upper and lower slashes and 1/2 inch to the tops and bottoms. I cut the bodies out of the velvet. I made a center back seam and the thing opened at center front to allow for 4 separate panels that just barely fit into the surprisingly narrow vest panels. I cut the sleeve slashes from the leftover bits. I was eager to get the, let's face it, intimidating sleeves out of the way, so I began that journey by placing each upper slashing panel right side down against the right side of one of the satin pieces. I'll also mention that I lengthened these by about 1/2 inch so that they would blouse out slightly. I cut around each piece. I stitched the satin and velvet together along the long edges. I turned the piece right side out and pressed the edges flat. There are probably hundreds of ways to make the puffed lining. This wasn't the best way, but it was how my mind comprehended the task in that moment. I cut the upper sleeve cap as a whole piece from a white cotton sateen. I laid it against a nice big piece of the satin, wrong sides together, and scrunched the satin up to create volume. I stitched at 1/4 inch in around the perimeter. I basted each slashing panel in place along the top and bottom by hand and set the piece aside. I used the same cotton sateen as the lining for the rest of the garment. I again placed each lower slashing piece against the cotton sateen right sides together. I again stitched along the long edges and pressed. I made an actual pattern for the puffed lining of the bottom slashing by enlarging the normal pattern piece by 20%. I pinned this to an unenlarged cotton sateen stay layer. The good thing about these puffing layers is they did not need to be perfect. Once this was stitched around the perimeter, I carefully placed all the slashed portions over the top. I had made them a bit longer than necessary in case I found they needed to be longer to have the correct effect. I tried 2 inches longer, 1 inch longer, but the same length as the stay layer was all that was necessary. I'll also take this opportunity to point out that there are many iterations of slashed bodices found in Renaissance art. My mind immediately went to early 16th century ideas, especially with the square neckline, but the costume bodice is definitely channeling more of a late 16th, early 17th century look. But really, this historical lesson has all been a distraction because, surprisingly for the first time, my camera's memory card went bad as I was using it and I lost about 31 videos. Which sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's not so bad. Let's face it, the sleeves are kind of the star of the show anyway. Let's look at this thing and piece together the next few steps till the footage picks back up. So after I had the upper and lower sleeve panels made, I matched the upper sleeve to the lower sleeve, right sides together, and machine stitched. I matched the complete sleeve top with the sleeve bottom panel, right sides together, along with the lining panels. So the layering of this little parfait went sleeve top, sleeve bottom lining, sleeve top lining, and then I machine stitched along the edge. I then opened the parfait up along the self and top stitched to keep the hefty seam allowance in place. Because it was kind of confusing, I went in and hand-stitched the self and lining sleeve side seams separately. I constructed the body of the garment in a pretty standard way. You can reference the original Gucci video because it was basically the same as the vest, right down to accidentally stitching the lining in twisted. Not super sad to have lost that footage. I ended up connecting the sleeve and body lining with a piece of twill tape, which I stitched in by hand. I added another twill tape to the sleeve self along the wrist edge, folded it with a lip of self to the inside, and hand-stitched it to the lining similarly to this footage. Woot woot! This was the center front opening of the bodice, which I finished by stitching a piece of twill tape over the right side edge, then folding that to the inside and hand-stitching it down. I originally wanted to use a heavy-duty hook and eye closure at the center front neckline, but it was too clunky for this application. Instead, I channeled the backwards-facing cardigan and stitched a twill tape tie to the neckline edge. First by stitching it right side to lining with the raw edge facing center front, then I folded the tie towards center front and restitched along the edges to enclose the raw edge. I added a second set of ties 3 inches below the first. One of the beautiful things about design is its subjectivity. Every one of us is different, with varying needs and preferences. And by far the best thing about designing things for oneself is figuring out those needs and preferences, and making adjustments when something isn't right, or completely taking something apart and remaking it, as was common practice historically, by the way. What I learned this time around is that I'd rather make a statement than be cute. And yeah, I've worn this twice already. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and hit subscribe if you enjoy making the most of past experimentation. I have loads more ensembles to redo, but first I have a fun little project that will be up in the next couple of weeks. Bye!